You wake up motivated. You tell yourself this time will be different. You're going to be consistent, focused, disciplined, and for a few days you are. You start strong. You make progress. You feel like you're finally becoming the person you wanted to be. And then something shifts. Not something obvious. Not something dramatic. Just a small change. You delay one thing. You lose focus for a day. You tell yourself you'll get back on track tomorrow. But tomorrow comes and you don't. And deep down, there's a quiet thought you don't want to face. Why do I keep doing this to myself? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never realize. You're not stuck. You're repeating the same patterns, the same decisions, the same invisible behaviors that quietly bring you back to the same place over and over again. So when the most dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like logic. It feels like you're being careful. Like you're waiting for the right moment. Like you're protecting yourself from failure. I know this because I've been there. There was a time when I thought my problem was discipline. I thought I needed more motivation, better habits, a stronger mindset. But no matter what I tried, I kept ending up in the same place. Starting, stopping, starting again, and every time I had a reason that made sense. That's what finally made me question everything. Because if it keeps happening and it always feels reasonable, then maybe it's not random. Maybe it's a pattern. And once that idea hit me, something shifted. I started noticing the exact moments I would pull back. Right when things were about to matter. And right when progress started to feel real. I would hesitate, doubt, delay, not because I was lazy, but because something in me was trying to keep me the same. That's when I realized something most people never see. Your brain is not always trying to help you grow. Sometimes it's trying to keep you familiar. Even if that familiarity is keeping you stuck. Even if it's quietly destroying your progress. And it does this in ways so subtle, you don't even notice it's happening. That's why people stay in the same place for years. Not because they lack potential, but because they're following patterns they've never learned to see. And you can't change a pattern you don't even know you're running. So in this video, we're not going to talk about motivation. We're not going to give you surface level advice. We're going deeper than that. We're going to break down the hidden patterns that make you sabotage yourself without even realizing it. The subtle ways your brain pulls you back. The emotional triggers you don't see. The identity you're protecting without knowing it. And most importantly, how to step out of these patterns without fighting yourself. Because the truth is, you were never broken. You were never incapable. You were just repeating something that felt familiar. And once you see it clearly, that's the moment everything starts to change. Chapter 1. The invisible pattern running your life. There's a version of your life that almost happened. You were close. Closer than most people think. Maybe it was that time you finally got serious about your goals. You woke up early. You stayed consistent. You felt in control. For a moment it felt different. Like this time it was real. But then something changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just enough to pull you slightly off track. You skipped one day. Then another. Then you told yourself you needed a break. And before you knew it, you were back where you started. If you're honest, this isn't the first time it's happened. In fact, it might be a pattern. A quiet, repeating loop that shows up in different areas of your life. You start something. You build momentum. You get close to progress. And then you stop. Not because you can't continue. But because something inside you shifts. Most people explain this the wrong way. They say it's laziness, a lack of discipline, a motivation problem. But that explanation doesn't hold up. Because you can be disciplined. You've proven that. There are moments when you're focused, committed, even obsessed. So why doesn't it last? Why does the same cycle keep repeating? Here's the truth most people never see. You're not failing randomly. You're following a pattern. And that pattern is invisible until you learn how to see it. Think about this. If you were truly inconsistent, you would be inconsistent at everything. But you're not. There are areas of your life where you show up easily, where effort feels natural, where discipline doesn't feel forced. Which means the problem isn't your ability. The problem is where and when your behavior changes. And that's where the pattern lives. It lives in the transition point. The moment where things start to matter. The moment where progress becomes real. The moment where continuing forward would actually change something in your life. That's when the shift happens. That's when the hesitation appears. That's when you begin to pull back. Not consciously, not intentionally, but consistently. I've seen this play out more times than I can count. Someone gets close to a breakthrough. Their habits are aligned. Their energy is high. Their results start improving. And then suddenly they slow down. They distract themselves. They lose focus. They find reasons to step away. And when you ask them why, they always have an answer. I just needed a break. It wasn't the right time. I didn't feel ready yet. It all sounds reasonable. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because when something sounds logical, you don't question it. You follow it. But here's the deeper truth. Not every thought you trust is actually helping you. Some of them are protecting a pattern. A pattern designed to keep you within a certain range. Not too far behind, but never too far ahead. Because moving forward doesn't just bring success. It brings uncertainty, responsibility, visibility, pressure. And your brain is wired to avoid those things unless it feels safe. So what does it do? It creates small, believable reasons to slow you down. To pause. To wait. To step back just enough to return to what feels familiar. Suddenly you accept those reasons. Because they don't feel like sabotage. They feel like you. That's the trap. Self-sabotage doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like a reasonable decision in the moment. And by the time you realize what happened, the pattern has already repeated. You're back at the beginning. Looking at the same goals. Feeling the same frustration. Telling yourself, why does this keep happening? But that question keeps you stuck. Because it assumes something is wrong with you. Instead, ask a different question. What is the pattern here? Because once you see the pattern, everything starts to make sense. You realize it's not about motivation. It's about timing. You don't lose discipline randomly. You lose it at specific moments. Moments where continuing forward would force you to become someone different. And that's where most people unconsciously resist. Not because they don't want success, but because success requires a shift they haven't accepted yet. A new identity, a new level of responsibility, a new version of themselves that feels unfamiliar. And the human brain has a simple rule. It prefers familiarity over improvement, even if that familiarity is keeping you stuck. So instead of moving forward, you repeat. You return to what you know. You reset the cycle, and you do it so smoothly, so subtly, you don't even notice it's happening. Until you step back and look at your life. And you realize you've been here before. More than once, maybe many times. That's not failure. That's a loop. And loops don't break with effort. They break with awareness. Because the moment you see the pattern clearly, you create space between you and the behavior. You're no longer inside it. You're observing it, and that changes everything. Because now, when the moment comes, when you feel the urge to delay, to hesitate, to step back, you can pause. And recognize it for what it is. Not truth, not logic, but a pattern trying to repeat itself. And in that pause, you get your power back. Not by forcing yourself forward, but by choosing differently. That's where change begins. Not in big decisions, not in motivation, but in the quiet moment where you see the pattern and don't follow it. Because the truth is, your life isn't controlled by what you want. It's controlled by what you repeat. And until you see what you're repeating, you'll keep calling it bad luck. Chapter 2. Why your brain chooses familiar pain. She knew it would hurt. That's the strange part. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't uncertainty. She knew exactly how it would end. And still she went back. Back to the same conversations, the same patterns, the same person who had already shown her who they were. If you asked her why, she wouldn't say she wanted pain. She'd say things like, "It's complicated. You wouldn't understand. It's not always bad." And maybe that's true, because the most dangerous patterns in your life are not the ones that are always painful. They're the ones that are partially rewarding. Just enough good to make you ignore what you already know. This doesn't just happen in relationships, it happens everywhere. You go back to habits that drain you. You stay in situations that limit you. You repeat behaviors that keep you stuck. And every time there's a quiet justification. It's not that bad. I'll change it later. This is just how things are right now. But underneath all of that, there's a deeper force at work. One that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with familiarity. Your brain has a simple priority. Not happiness, not success, familiarity. Because what's familiar feels safe, even if it's painful, even if it's limiting, even if it's slowly destroying your progress. It still feels known, and the brain would rather choose a known pain than an unknown outcome. That's the part most people don't understand. You're not always moving toward what's better. Sometimes you're moving toward what feels familiar. Think about that. Why would someone stay in a situation they know isn't good for them? Why would someone repeat the same mistakes even after experiencing the consequences? Why would someone sabotage progress right when things start improving? Because improvement is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels dangerous, even if logically you know it's better. This is why change feels uncomfortable. Not because it's hard, but because it's different. And different triggers resistance. I've seen this in my own life. There were moments where things were actually going well. Opportunities were opening. Progress was real. Momentum was building. And instead of leaning into it, I pulled back. I distracted myself. I questioned things that didn't need questioning. I slowed down for no clear reason. At the time I thought I was just being careful, but looking back, I can see what was really happening. So I was stepping away from something unfamiliar. Something that required me to grow. And without realizing it, I chose to return to what felt known. Even if that meant staying the same. That's when I understood something that changed everything. You don't always choose what's good for you. You choose what feels like you. And if your current identity is built around struggle, then struggle will feel normal. If your life has been shaped by inconsistency, then consistency will feel uncomfortable. If you're used to holding yourself back, then moving forward will feel unnatural. So what do? You go back, not because you want to fail, but because failure, in a strange way, feels familiar. That's why people repeat patterns that hurt them. Not because they enjoy the pain, but because the pain is predictable. And predictability feels safe. Let that sink in. Your brain will choose a predictable pain over an unpredictable improvement. And once you see that, a lot of your past decisions start to make sense. The times you went back, the times you quit, the times you slowed down for no reason. It wasn't random, it was familiar. That's the loop. And until you understand it, you'll keep thinking you need more discipline, more motivation, more effort. But effort doesn't solve this. Because the problem isn't that you don't try, it's that at a certain point, you return. Return to the same emotional state, the same behaviors, the same level of life you're used to. And you do it so naturally, it feels like nothing even happened. But something did happen. You chose familiarity over growth. And that choice is happening more often than you realize. So the question becomes, how do you break that? Not by forcing yourself to change, not by pushing harder, but by seeing clearly. The next time you feel the urge to go back, pause. And ask yourself, is this actually what I want? Or is this just what feels familiar? That question creates distance. Distance between you and the automatic behavior. And in that distance, you get a choice. A real one. Not driven by habit, not driven by emotion, but driven by awareness. Because once you recognize familiarity for what it is, it loses its power to control you unconsciously. And slowly, you begin to tolerate something new. Discomfort. Not the kind that comes from pain, but the kind that comes from growth. The kind that feels unfamiliar, uncertain, even a little unstable, but real. That's the discomfort that leads somewhere different. And if you can stay there, just a little longer than before, the pattern starts to break. Not all at once, but gradually. And that's how your life begins to change. Not because you forced yourself into something new, but because you stopped automatically returning to what felt safe. Even when safe was keeping you stuck. Because in the end, familiar doesn't mean right. It just means repeated. Chapter 3. The identity that keeps you stuck. I'm just not that kind of person. It sounds harmless, almost honest, like you're simply accepting who you are. But if you listen closely, that sentence has more power over your life than almost anything else you say. Because the moment you define yourself that way, you stop trying to become anything else. I remember talking to someone who kept struggling with the same problem for years. He wasn't lazy. He worked hard. He had goals. He wanted to improve. But every time he got close to making real progress, he would pull back. He would hesitate, overthink, delay, and eventually he would stop. Not completely, just enough to stay where he was. One day, I asked him a simple question. Why do you think this keeps happening? He didn't pause. He didn't reflect. He answered immediately. That's just how I am. That sentence ended the conversation before it even started. Because once you believe that, there's nothing left to change. That's the trap of identity. It doesn't just describe your behavior, it controls it. Most people think their actions create their identity. But in reality, your identity creates your actions. You don't act first and then become someone. You become someone and then act accordingly. Which means if your identity is, I'm inconsistent. I'm not confident. I always mess things up. I'm not disciplined. Then your brain will make sure your behavior matches that. Not because you're trying to fail, but because your brain values consistency. Not consistency in your actions. Consistency in who you believe you are. Let that sink in. You don't sabotage your goals. You protect your identity. That's why change feels so difficult. Because it's not just about doing something different. It's about becoming someone different. And that's where the resistance comes from. Not from effort, but from identity conflict. You start doing something new. You build a new habit. You move in a different direction. And for a while, it works. But then something inside you starts to feel off. Uncomfortable, unfamiliar, almost like you're pretending. Like this version of you isn't real. That feeling triggers something subtle. You begin to pull back. Not because the habit is wrong, but because it doesn't match who you believe you are. So what do? You return. Return to behaviors that feel more like you. Even if those behaviors are the exact ones that have been holding you back. I've experienced this more times than I can count. There were moments where I was becoming more disciplined, more focused, more consistent. And instead of feeling proud, I felt strange. Like I was stepping into a version of myself I wasn't fully comfortable with yet. And without realizing it, I would break the pattern, skip something, delay something, distract myself. Not because I wanted to fail, but because I was unconsciously returning to an identity felt familiar. That's when I understood something most people miss. You will always act in alignment with the person you believe you are. Not the person you want to be. Not the person you say you want to become, but the person you deeply believe you are. And if those two don't match, your behavior will always follow your belief. That's why goals alone don't work. You can set goals all day. You can plan. You can prepare. You can even take action. But if your identity hasn't shifted, you will eventually return to your baseline. That's the pattern, and it's incredibly consistent. Because identity is stable, it resists change. It protects itself. even when that identity is limiting you, even when it's keeping you stuck, even when it's quietly destroying your progress. Because to your brain, being consistent with who you are feels safer than becoming someone new. So the question becomes, how do you change that? Not by forcing yourself to act differently, not by trying to override your behavior, but by becoming aware of the identity you're operating from. Pay attention to the way you talk about yourself. The small statements you repeat without thinking. I'm not good at this. I've always been like this. This is just who I am. Those aren't observations. They're instructions. Instructions your brain will follow over and over again until they become reality. So instead of asking, how do I change my behavior? Ask a different question. Who do I believe I am right now? Because that answer explains everything. It explains your patterns, your habits, your results. And once you see that clearly, you realize something powerful. Your identity is not fixed. It's learned, built over time through repetition, experience, and belief. Which means it can also be changed. Not instantly, not overnight, but gradually, through small shifts in awareness and action. You don't need to become a completely different person tomorrow. You just need to stop reinforcing the version of yourself that's keeping you stuck. And start stepping slowly, consistently, into a new one. Even if it feels unfamiliar. Even if it feels uncomfortable. Because that discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're moving beyond who you used to be. And if you can stay there, just a little longer each time, something begins to shift. Not just your actions, but your sense of self. And once your identity changes, everything else follows. Because at that point, you're no longer trying to force new behavior. You're simply acting in alignment with who you've become. And that's when self-sabotage starts to lose its grip. Not because you eliminated it, but because it no longer fits who you are. Because in the end, you don't rise to your goals. You fall to your identity. Chapter 4. The emotional triggers you don't see. It wasn't a big moment. No argument. No conflict. No obvious problem. Just a sentence. You could have done that better. That was it. Simple. Direct. Almost neutral. On the outside, nothing happened. He nodded. Kept working. Didn't react. But inside, something shifted. His focus broke. The energy he had just a few minutes ago disappeared. The confidence he felt earlier, gone. And in its place, something else quietly took over. Doubt. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to change how he felt. And once that feeling changed, everything else followed. He started overthinking small things. Second-guessing decisions that normally felt easy. Slowing down without even realizing it. By the end of the day, he told himself, I'm just off today. But it wasn't the day. It was the trigger. That's how this works. Not through big events. Through small emotional shifts you don't even notice in real time. Most people think their behavior is logical. That they act based on decisions. But that's not what actually happened. You don't act based on logic. You act based on how you feel. And most of those feelings are triggered automatically. Something happens. You feel something. And then you react. So quickly, it feels like one single moment. But it's not. It's a chain. Trigger to emotion to reaction. And if you don't see the trigger, you think the reaction is just who you are. That's the problem. Because once you believe that, you stop questioning it. You stop interrupting it. You just repeat it, over and over again. I've seen this play out in so many different ways. Someone gets ignored in a conversation, and they suddenly feel invisible. So they pull back, stop contributing, stop engaging. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because something inside them said, you're not valued here. Another person receives a small piece of feedback. Nothing harsh, but it hits something deeper. They feel criticized, so they shut down, lose motivation, avoid the task completely, not because they can't do it, but because the feeling changed. And once the feeling changed, their behavior followed. This is where self-sabotage becomes invisible. Because from the outside, it looks like inconsistency. It looks like a lack of discipline. It looks like you just lost motivation. But underneath that, there's always a trigger. A moment where something emotional shifted. And that shift redirected your behavior. The dangerous part is most of these triggers come from the past. Not the present. That comment you reacted to, it's not just about that moment. It's connected to something older. A memory, an experience, a belief you've carried for years. Maybe you were criticized growing up. Maybe you learned that mistakes weren't safe. Maybe you associated feedback with failure. So now, even a neutral comment feels like a threat. And your brain reacts instantly. Not to the situation, but to what it represents. That's why two people can experience the same moment and react completely differently. Because they're not reacting to the same thing. They're reacting to different meanings. You don't react to reality. You react to interpretation. And those interpretations are automatic. Fast, unconscious, deeply ingrained. So by the time you notice your behavior has changed, the trigger has already done its job. You've already pulled back. You've already slowed down. You've already sabotaged the moment. And then you explained it logically. I just didn't feel like it. I lost focus. I needed a break. But those are not causes. They're explanations after the fact. The real cause happened earlier. In a moment so small, you didn't even see it. That's why awareness here is so powerful. Because once you start noticing these triggers, everything begins to make sense. You start to see patterns. You realize that certain situations always lead to the same reaction. Certain people always trigger the same emotion. Certain thoughts always pull you in the same direction. And once you see that clearly, you get a window. A small pause between the trigger and the reaction. And in that pause, you have a choice. Not a perfect one. Not an easy one. But a real one. You can follow the same reaction. Or you can interrupt it. Even slightly. Even for a few seconds. And that's where change begins. Not by controlling your emotions, but by recognizing them. The next time something feels off, don't rush to fix it. Don't label it immediately. Just pause. And ask yourself, what just triggered this? Not, what's wrong with me? Not, why can't I stay consistent? But, what happened right before I started feeling this way? That question will show you more than any motivational advice ever will. Because it brings you back to the source. The real cause. The moment where everything shifted. And once you can see that moment, you're no longer inside the pattern. You're observing it, and that changes everything. Because you can't control what you don't see. But once you see it clearly, it loses its power to control you unconsciously. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to give you space. And in that space, you begin to respond differently. More consciously, more intentionally. More like the person you're trying to become. Because in the end, self-sabotage is not random. It's triggered. And once you see the triggers, you stop blaming yourself and start understanding yourself. And that's where real change begins. Chapter 5. The Hidden Rewards of Self-Sabotage. He was close. Closer than he had ever been before. Everything was finally working. The habits were consistent. The results were showing. People around him started noticing the change. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was actually becoming someone different. And then, he stopped. Not completely. Just enough to slow everything down. He started skipping small things, breaking routines that had been working. Distracting himself with things that didn't matter. If you asked him why, he wouldn't say he was afraid. He wouldn't say he wanted to fail. He would say something like, I just needed a break. I didn't want to burn out. I'll get back to it soon. And maybe part of that was true. But it wasn't the full truth. Because what was really happening was something much deeper. Something most people never realize. Self-sabotage is not just destruction, it's protection. That's why it's so hard to break. Because part of you benefits from it. That's the hidden reward. And until you see that reward clearly, you will keep repeating the pattern. Think about this. Why would someone sabotage their own progress? Why would someone stop right when things start working? Why would someone go back to what hurts them? It doesn't make sense, unless there's something they're gaining from it. And there is, always. Sometimes it's obvious, but most of the time, it's invisible. Self-sabotage protects you from things you don't consciously think about. It protects you from failure. Because if you never fully try, you never fully fail. It protects you from judgment. Because if you don't reach your potential, no one can criticize the real version of you. It protects you from responsibility, because success doesn't just give you results. It gives you pressure, expectations, standards, a new level you have to maintain. And for many people, that's more uncomfortable than staying where they are. Let that sink in. Sometimes you don't sabotage your life because you're afraid of failing. You sabotage it because you're afraid of succeeding. Because success exposes you. It removes excuses. It forces you to show up consistently. It forces you to become someone you're not fully comfortable being yet. And if your identity isn't ready for that, your brain will find a way to pull you back. Not aggressively, not obviously, subtly. Through small decisions that feel harmless in the moment. Skipping one day, delaying one task, losing focus just a little. But those small decisions add up. And before you realize it, you've stepped away from everything you were building. And it feels natural. That's the most dangerous part. Because if it felt wrong, you would stop. But it doesn't feel wrong. It feels justified. It feels like you're making a smart decision. And that's why the pattern continues. I've experienced this personally. There were times when everything started aligning. Progress felt real. Momentum was strong. And instead of pushing forward, I slowed down. I told myself I needed balance. That I shouldn't rush. That I should take it easy for a while. And again, part of that was true. But looking back, I can see something else was happening. I was stepping away from a version of myself that felt unfamiliar. And a version that required more from me. More consistency, more discipline, more responsibility. And without realizing it, I chose comfort over growth. Not consciously, but consistently. That's when I understood something that changed everything. You will not change your behavior until you understand what that behavior is protecting you from. Because every pattern you repeat is solving a problem. Even if that solution is limiting you. Even if it's keeping you stuck, it's still serving a purpose. And until you identify that purpose, you'll keep trying to fix the behavior without understanding why it exists. That's why most people fail to change. They try to remove the pattern without replacing the protection. So their brain resists. Because from its perspective, you're taking away something important. Something that keeps you safe. But even if that safety is costing you your potential. So instead of asking, how do I stop sabotaging myself? Ask a different question. What is this behavior protecting me from? That question changes everything. Because now you're not fighting yourself. You're understanding yourself. You start to see the hidden rewards. The ways your behavior has been helping you avoid fear, pressure, exposure, uncertainty. And once you see that clearly, you have a choice. You can keep the protection, or you can outgrow it. Not by forcing yourself forward, but by becoming someone who no longer needs that protection. Because here's the truth. The version of you that sabotages progress is trying to keep you safe. But it's using old rules. Rules that made sense in the past. Rules that helped you survive. But those same rules are now limiting your growth. And growth requires something different. It requires discomfort, uncertainty, risk, exposure. Things your brain naturally wants to avoid. So instead of trying to eliminate that resistance, you learn to understand it. To recognize it. To see when it's showing up. And in those moments, you don't blindly follow it. You pause and ask, is this protecting me? Or is this holding me back? That question creates awareness. And awareness weakens the pattern. Not instantly, but gradually. Until one day, the behavior that used to feel automatic starts to feel optional. And that's when everything changes. Because now, you're no longer controlled by hidden rewards. You see them, you understand them, and you choose differently. Even if it feels uncomfortable. Even if it feels unfamiliar. Because you've realized something most people never do. What feels safe is not always what helps you grow. And once you stop confusing those two things, self-sabotage begins to lose its power. Not because you forced it away, but because you no longer need it. Chapter 6. The moment you become aware. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no big breakthrough. No dramatic turning point. Just a small moment that feels different. You're about to do what you've always done. Delay. Pull back. Avoid something that matters. And then, you notice it. Not after. Not when it's too late. But in the exact moment it's about to happen. That's new. Because before this, everything felt automatic. You didn't see the pattern. You were inside it. But now, there's a gap. A small space between the impulse and the action. And inside that space, you see something clearly for the first time. This again. That thought changes everything. Because it breaks the illusion. The illusion that your behavior is random. The illusion that this is just how you are. The illusion that you have no control. Yet you realize something uncomfortable and freeing at the same time. You've been here before. More than once. Many times. The same hesitation. The same feeling. The same decision. Just in different situations. And now, you can see it. That's awareness. And it's more powerful than most people think. Because the moment you see the pattern, you're no longer fully controlled by it. You're still influenced by it. You still feel the pull. But you're not completely inside it anymore. You're observing it. That changes the relationship. Instead of, I don't feel like doing this. It becomes, I notice I'm starting to avoid this. That shift might seem small, but it's everything. Because now, you're not your behavior. You're the one watching it. And once that separation exists, choice becomes possible. So now I remember the first time I experienced this clearly. I was about to delay something important. Something I'd already postponed before. And the familiar thought showed up, I'll do it later. Normally, I would have followed it automatically, but this time, something paused. Not forced, not intentional. Just a moment of awareness, and I caught it, that exact pattern, the same thought that had pulled me back before. And for the first time, I didn't fully believe it. That was new. Because before, those thoughts felt like truth. Now, they felt like patterns. And once you see something as a pattern, it loses its authority. It's no longer, this is what I should do. It becomes, this is what I usually do. That distinction creates space, and in that space, you get a choice. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a real one. You can follow the pattern, or you can interrupt it, even slightly, even imperfectly, and that's where real change begins. Not in big decisions, but in small interruptions. Because you don't break a pattern all at once. You weaken it, moment by moment. Every time you see it and don't fully follow it, that's how awareness works. It doesn't eliminate the behavior instantly. It exposes it, and exposure reduces its power. Over time, what used to feel automatic starts to feel optional, and that's when everything starts to shift. But here's the part most people don't expect. Awareness can feel uncomfortable, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You notice how often it shows up, how many times you've repeated it, how many opportunities you've stepped away from, and that realization can hit hard. You suddenly might think, how long have I been doing this? Why didn't I notice earlier? That's normal, but don't get stuck there. Because awareness is not meant to create regret, it's meant to create clarity. And clarity gives you something most people never have. A way out. Not through force, not through motivation, but through understanding. Because once you understand the pattern, you stop blaming yourself. You stop thinking, I'm just inconsistent. I lack discipline. I always mess things up. And instead, you start seeing the truth. I've been repeating something I didn't notice. That shift removes a lot of unnecessary pressure, because now, you're not trying to fix yourself. You're learning to observe yourself, and that changes the entire approach. Instead of pushing harder, you become more aware. Instead of forcing discipline, you recognize patterns. Instead of fighting yourself, you understand yourself. And understanding is what allows real change to happen, because you can't fight something you don't fully see. But once you see it clearly, you don't need to fight it as much. You just need to stop blindly following it. That's the key. Not control, not perfection, just awareness. The next time you feel that familiar pull to delay, to avoid, to step back, pause. Not to force yourself forward, but to notice. What's happening right now? That question brings you back into awareness, back into that small space between impulse and action. And in that space, you begin to choose differently, even if it's just 10% different, even if it's just a slight shift. That's enough. Because small shifts repeated over time create a completely different pattern. And once the pattern changes, your life follows. Because in the end, awareness is the moment you step outside the loop. And once you're outside it, you're no longer trapped inside it. Chapter 7. Breaking the pattern without fighting yourself. Most people try to change the wrong way. They fight themselves. They push harder, force discipline, try to override every impulse that feels uncomfortable. For a while, it works. They stay consistent. They follow through. They feel in control. But eventually, they burn out. They fall back into the same patterns. And when that happens, they assume the problem is effort. That means I need more discipline. I need to try harder next time. I just need to be stronger. But that's not the problem, because if effort alone worked, you would have already changed. You've tried before. You've pushed yourself before. And yet, the pattern came back. So maybe the solution isn't force. Maybe the solution is something else. Something quieter. Something most people overlook. Understanding. Because here's the truth. You don't break patterns by fighting them. You break patterns by seeing them clearly and choosing differently. That might sound simple, but it changes everything. Because now, you're not trying to control every behavior. You're learning to interrupt the pattern at the exact moment it begins. Not after. Not when the damage is done, but in real time. That's where your power is. I want you to think about the last time you sabotaged something. Not a big failure. Just a small moment where you delayed, avoided, pulled back. At that moment, it didn't feel like sabotage. It felt normal, reasonable, almost automatic. That's the moment you're looking for. The moment where the pattern starts. Because if you can recognize that moment, you don't need to control everything after. You just need to shift it slightly. Not perfectly. Just enough to break the flow. That's how patterns weaken. Not through perfection, through interruption. Let me show you what that looks like. You're about to delay something important. The thought appears, I'll do it later. Instead of fighting that thought, notice it. This is the pattern. That's step 1, awareness. Then step 2, don't argue with it. Don't try to eliminate it. Just don't fully follow it. Maybe you don't complete the entire task, but you start it, even for a few minutes. That's enough. Because now, you've disrupted the pattern. You didn't let it run completely, and that changes the trajectory. Most people underestimate this. They think change requires a complete transformation. A perfect execution. But it doesn't. It requires small deviations from the pattern, repeated over time. But that's what creates a new identity. Not one big decision, but many small ones made in moments that used to be automatic. This is where things start to feel different. Because instead of, I need to fix my life, it becomes, I need to respond differently in this moment. That's manageable. That's real. And that's sustainable. Because you're not trying to become a different person overnight. You're becoming slightly different moment by moment. And those moments add up. I've experienced this shift personally. There was a time when I thought I needed to completely change who I was. New habits, new mindset, new system. But every time I tried that, it felt overwhelming. And eventually, I would fall back. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I was trying to change too much at once. What actually worked was much simpler. And I stopped trying to control everything, and started paying attention to key moments. The moments where I would normally avoid, delay, distract. And in those moments, I made a small shift. Not a perfect one, just enough to not repeat the pattern exactly. And over time, those small shifts became natural. What used to feel difficult started to feel normal. And that's when I realized something important. You don't need to become a completely new person. You just need to stop being the old one in small moments. That's how change happens. Quietly, gradually, without force. Because force creates resistance, but awareness creates choice. And choice creates change. So instead of asking, how do I stay disciplined all the time? Ask something more useful. What is one moment today where I can respond differently? Just one. That's enough. Because that one moment breaks the illusion that you're stuck. It proves that the pattern is not permanent. That it can be interrupted. That it can be changed. And once you experience that, everything shifts. Because now, you're not hoping to change. You've seen that you can. That's powerful. Not because it guarantees success, but because it removes the belief that you're controlled by your patterns. You're not. You've just been following them unconsciously. Now, you're not. Now, you're aware. And awareness gives you something most people never develop: consistency in choice. Not perfect behavior, not constant motivation, but the ability to choose differently in moments that used to control you. And over time, those choices redefine who you are, not through force, but through repetition. A new pattern begins to form, one that supports you instead of holding you back. And once that pattern becomes familiar, everything that used to feel difficult starts to feel natural. That's the goal, not to fight yourself forever, but to reach a point where you no longer need to. Because in the end, real change doesn't come from forcing yourself forward. It comes from no longer automatically going backward. And that shift changes everything. Chapter 8. Becoming someone who no longer self-sabotages. At some point, it stops feeling like a battle. Not because everything becomes easy, not because the thoughts disappear, but because something deeper changes. There's a moment most people don't notice right away, a quiet shift where you respond differently without forcing yourself to. Where the things that used to pull you back don't have the same power anymore. Not completely gone, but weaker, less convincing, less automatic. You hesitate, but in a different way, not because you're avoiding, but because you're aware. And that awareness creates space, and in that space, you start choosing differently, again and again and again, until one day it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like you. That's when the pattern has changed, not on the surface, but at the level that actually matters. Identity. Because in the beginning, you were trying to act differently. You were trying to stay disciplined, stay consistent, stay in control. But now, you're no longer trying to be that person. You are that person, and that changes everything. Because when your identity shifts, your behavior follows naturally. You don't need to force yourself to act. You don't need to convince yourself. You don't need to fight the same internal battles. Because the version of you that used to sabotage progress no longer fits. It feels outdated, like something you've outgrown. I want you to think about that for a moment. There was a time when your current patterns felt normal, even comfortable, even if they were holding you back. Now imagine reaching a point where those same patterns feel strange, unfamiliar, and even uncomfortable. That's the shift, and it doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually through small moments where you chose differently, moments where you paused, where you noticed, where you didn't automatically follow the same path. At first, those moments feel rare. Then they become more frequent, and over time, they become your default. That's how identity changes, not through one big decision, but through repeated proof. Proof that you are capable of something different. Proof that you don't have to follow the same pattern. Proof that you can respond in a new way. And once you have enough of that proof, your brain updates the story of who you are. And that story matters more than anything else. Because once your brain believes, this is who I am now, everything aligns with it. Your actions, your decisions, your standards. They all begin to match that identity without force, without struggle. That's when self-sabotage starts to disappear. Not because you eliminated it, but because it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to an older version of you, one that you've moved beyond. And when that happens, something else appears. Clarity, not confusion, not hesitation, clarity. You know what matters. You know what to do. And more importantly, you follow through. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because consistency is no longer something you try to achieve, it's something that reflects who you are. That's the difference. Most people are trying to act like someone they're not yet, and that creates friction, resistance, exhaustion. But when you become that person, there's no friction. There's alignment. And alignment is effortless compared to force. That's why this process matters. Because it's not about fixing your behavior, it's about evolving your identity. From someone who reacts to someone who observes. From someone who repeats patterns to someone who recognizes them. From someone who sabotages progress to someone who sustains it. And once you make that shift, everything changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because now, you're not relying on motivation. You're not depending on discipline alone. You're operating from a different place, a place where your actions are aligned with who you've become. And that's stable, that lasts, that compounds over time. I want to leave you with something simple, but powerful. You don't need to become perfect. You don't need to eliminate every mistake. You don't need to control every thought. You just need to stop automatically becoming the version of yourself that holds you back even in small moments. Because those moments define everything. Every time you pause instead of react, you change something. Every time you notice instead of follow, you change something. Every time you choose differently, you change something. And those changes add up. Until one day, you look at your life and realize something quietly incredible. You're no longer the person who used to sabotage it. Not because you tried harder, but because you saw more clearly. And once you saw clearly, you chose differently. And that choice, repeated over time, became who you are. Because in the end, your life doesn't change when you force yourself forward. It changes when you stop returning to who you used to be. And maybe this is the part no one tells you. The shift doesn't feel dramatic. There's no moment where everything suddenly clicks and your life becomes perfect. It's quieter than that, almost easy to miss. You just start noticing that the things that used to control you don't hit the same way anymore. The urge is still there sometimes. The thought still appears. The feeling still shows up. But it no longer owns you. It passes through you instead of pulling you with it. And that's when you realize you haven't just changed your behavior. You've changed your relationship with yourself. You trust yourself more, not because you're perfect, but because you've seen yourself choose differently when it actually mattered. And then that builds something most people spend years searching for. Self-respect. Not the kind that comes from success, but the kind that comes from alignment. From knowing that when the moment comes, you won't automatically disappear on yourself. You won't abandon your own progress. You won't return to the same patterns without noticing. And that changes how you move through life. You stop hesitating as much. You stop doubting every step. You stop questioning whether you'll fall off again. Because deep down, you know something is different now. Not perfect, but different enough. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Because once you trust that you won't sabotage yourself the same way, you start allowing yourself to go further, to try more, to commit more fully. Not because you're fearless, but because you're no longer unconsciously working against yourself. And when that internal resistance fades, even slightly, your life begins to open in ways it never could before. There's something most people misunderstand about change. They think it happens all at once, like a decision, a breakthrough, a moment where everything suddenly becomes different. But that's not how it really works. Real change is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It shows up in small moments, the ones no one else sees. A moment where you pause instead of react. A moment where you notice instead of follow. A moment where you choose something slightly different than what you've always done. And at first, those moments feel insignificant. Too small to matter. Too subtle to change anything. But they do. Because your life is not shaped by big decisions. It's shaped by what you repeat. And when what you repeat starts to change, your life follows. Not instantly, but inevitably. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that most people are not stuck because they lack potential. They're stuck because they don't see the patterns that are quietly controlling them. And once you don't see something, you can't change it. You just keep repeating it. Calling it bad luck, calling it inconsistency, calling it just how things are. But now, you see more than that. You've seen how patterns form, how they repeat, how they disguise themselves as logic. You've seen how your brain chooses familiarity over what's actually better for you. You've seen how identity shapes behavior, how triggers shift your actions, how self-sabotage can actually feel like protection. And most importantly, you've seen that it's not permanent, that it can be interrupted, that it can be changed, not by force, but by awareness. That's the shift, and it's a powerful one. Because once you see things this way, you stop approaching your life like something is wrong with you. You stop trying to fix yourself, and you start observing yourself, understanding yourself, working with your patterns instead of unconsciously repeating them. That alone changes everything. Because when you understand yourself clearly, you stop being controlled by things you don't notice. And when you stop being controlled, you start choosing more consciously, more intentionally, more in alignment with who you want to become. That's where real freedom comes from. Not from having a perfect life. Not from eliminating every mistake. But from no longer being unconsciously pulled in directions you don't understand. And here's the part I want you to really take with you. You don't need to change everything today. You don't need to become a completely different person overnight. You don't need to fix every habit, every pattern, every flaw. You just need to start noticing. That's it. Because the moment you notice, you create space. And in that space, you create choice. And in that choice, you create change. Slowly, quietly, but powerfully. So, the next time you feel yourself about to fall into the same pattern, don't judge it. Don't fight it aggressively. Just pause. And ask yourself, is this what I actually want? Or is this just what I'm used to? That question alone can change the direction of your life. Not because it forces you to act, but because it brings you back to awareness. And awareness is where everything begins. If this made you think differently, if you saw yourself in any part of this, then take that as a sign. Not that something is wrong with you, but that something is ready to change. And you don't have to rush it. You don't have to prove anything. Just start paying attention, because the person you're becoming is not built in big moments. It's built in the small ones you used to ignore. And once you stop ignoring them, you stop repeating them. And when you stop repeating them, your life begins to move in a completely different direction. One that's not controlled by your past patterns, but shaped by your awareness. And that changes everything.